Okay, great. Well, hello everyone. My name is Michael Bila. I'm a rising third-year student at the University of Michigan Law School. I'm going to be presenting today a bit on space law and also the Society for Space Law, of which I am one of the board members. So I think this presentation will contrast pretty strongly with a lot of the other presentations that are at SEDS this year, just because we're not so much engineering focused, but more legal focused, obviously. So hopefully it'll be interesting. And of course, like all the other presentations, there'll be time at the end if anyone has any questions. So just again, to start about me, I'm a rising third-year student. So I just finished my second of 3 years at the University of Michigan Law School with a focus in international law. And I am a board member on the Society for Space Law, which is what I'm going to talk about a bit today. And also, I'll talk about one of the big things that our society does is we participate in a space law moot court competition, which I participated in last year, and then I was the student advisor this year. So I'll talk a bit about what a space law moot court competition even is, and then what we did this year participating in it. So just an overview of my presentation, I'm going to talk a bit about what is space law, just because I think when you say it, it sounds like something, I guess maybe not to people more well-versed in it, like hopefully everyone here, but it sounds something kind of Star Trek-y, and you're like, you know, that can't be real. Like, what do you mean space law? Are we talking about, like, you know, people slinging guns in space or stealing rockets and stuff? But there are actually a lot of interesting legal issues in space law that are relevant right now, and especially, you know, that are sort of building in relevance as private companies and as, you know, countries start to launch more stuff. And just as there gets to be more things going on in space, there's obviously more legal questions that arise. So I'll talk a bit about what constitutes space law, then I'll give a few examples of some legal issues that you might find. And then at the end, I'll discuss the Society for Space Law, kind of what we do and how we interact with that field as law students. So first, beginning with what is space law, I think it's important to distinguish, of course, two types of actors. You know, for many years, you would never talk about private companies in space law because they simply weren't doing a lot of business there. But you know, especially nowadays, the private companies are becoming even more relevant than governments in terms of space operations and what's going on and what causes legal issues to arise. And so, you know, when you're talking about what law governs, you do have to distinguish the laws that govern governments and then the laws that govern private companies. And so what are those laws? Well, there are two main sources. And I mean, international and national law, that basically encompasses everything, obviously, but really international law governs the countries, and then national law will govern the private companies. And both of them kind of draw on each other and play off of each other. So in international law, there are sort of what is called the 5 UN treaties on outer space, which I'll discuss a bit on the next slide. Those are kind of the really key, big, they're really general in language. They're incredibly broad. They were signed many years ago, and they just kind of cover all kinds of different countries' obligations in space. Also, one thing that really confused me in international law, people call countries states, even though, you know, we would call, like, you know, Maine or Washington a state. In international law context, you call a country a state. And so I'll try to say the word country, but if I say state, I'm talking about countries like, you know, the US or China or Russia, as opposed to, you know, Maine. So there are the 5 treaties on outer space signed between all these different countries. There's international case law, which is kind of surprising, but there are international courts. Just like, you know, in the United States, we have things like the Supreme Court. There are international courts that deal with international law issues. And while they haven't dealt with a lot of space law issues, they've dealt with a lot of international law questions more generally that can then be applied to space law in specific circumstances. And then, of course, you also have treaties between nations. You know, if 2 nations sign a treaty, you know, for example, the International Space Station is, you know, not so much covered by these other factors, but is really just operates under treaties between different nations as opposed to kind of by everybody. And then, of course, you have national law, which, like, for example, those 5 treaties, the UN treaties on outer space, sort of mandate that states or nations, excuse me, pass specific space-related laws within their countries that will govern how private companies must operate in space. And so those private companies obviously must obey those national laws depending on where they're launching from. You have national agencies that will cover that deal more specifically with space and might be more specific and narrowly tailored than the national laws. And then as well, you have just general business law. I mean, SpaceX or those kind of companies, they are at the end of the day just a business like everybody else, and so they are governed by the same rules that would govern any other business. It just so happens that some of their operations take place in space. And so to get more specific on some of the international law doctrines that govern space law, there are, like I said, the 5 space treaties, the Outer Space Treaty, which, as you can tell by its name, is incredibly broad, and it basically just sets out that all countries who have signed the treaty agree that space is to be used for exploration and not for things like warfare. There's the Rescue Agreement, which is an agreement between nations that they will help each other if something goes wrong in space. Whoever happens to be there has sort of agreed to be legally bound to help another country if they can't, get to their people if there's an incident on board a spacecraft. There's the Liability Convention, which governs who's responsible if something goes wrong. So if a spacecraft crashes into another spacecraft, or if it crashes into something on Earth, like I just read on the news that there's a spacecraft from China that's going to be crashing into Earth soon, and it's kind of an uncontrolled landing. And so if that happens to hit something, like I read, it's maybe supposed to land in some part of Australia. If it happens to damage something in Australia, the Liability Convention would discuss who is responsible and what they have to do about it. There's also the Registration Convention, which, as you can imagine, just says that anything you launch into space has to be registered. And there's a bunch of different little, it has to be registered to a company, and you have to know who's going to be responsible, who's going to pay for it, where it's launching from, where it intends to go, that kind of stuff. And then the Moon Agreement, which is, again, just a really broad treaty like the Outer Space Treaty that just agrees that nobody's going to lay claim to the moon as part of their country. And instead, it's going to be sort of a joint, it's for the citizens of Earth, not the citizens of any specific country. And then, as I said, you have international case law, which actually draws quite heavily on sea law, which is very interesting, even though they seem quite different. A lot of the principles can really be mirrored from sea law into space law. And we see a lot of, as space law is developing, there's a lot of principles and precedents from sea law that can help us understand how to navigate space law related issues. Because, just like space, the sea is kind of open for everyone, if you will, and it's just open terrain. And so there are a lot of legal principles we can draw on, and precedents just on general duties of countries to be responsible in launching things, also comes from international case law. And then, as I mentioned, treaties between nations, just sort of one-on-one treaties can also sort of determine which rules are going to apply. Like on the International Space Station, it has its own treaty between just the few nations that are involved in that. Or some nations undertake joint exploration missions where they both agree to fund and launch a mission, and that treaty between them would govern, kind of the rules and how that plays out. And then in terms of national law, obviously every single country has their own rules and regulations, but these are just some examples of national laws. You have US Code 51, which is on national and commercial space programs, or the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015. And so these are just national laws that are either born out of those treaty obligations, like I mentioned from the Outer Space Treaty. It kind of requires states or countries to pass their own laws. These are laws born from that, or like the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act is just a law that seeks to kind of jumpstart the space agencies within the United States. And that's not really part of a treaty obligation. That was just something the US was interested in doing. Then you have, of course, national agencies like NASA or China's or Russia's space agencies that are much more specific than maybe the US code in terms of setting rules or setting standards for how operations in space should be done. And then, of course, like I mentioned, you have just general business laws. I mean, SpaceX, they still have people inside of warehouses and inside of offices who are governed by labor laws and workplace safety. And there's also, a lot of rules on duty of care and designing products. So, SpaceX, if they design a rocket and it turns around and crashes back into the US, they're still governed by, business laws. And you would ask, were they responsible in that production? And was this a foreseeable circumstance? Those kind of things. And so now turning to some of the sort of types of legal issues, kind of what even is space law and is it a real thing? Yes, it's very much a real thing now, and it's certainly growing a lot. And so, all types of legal issues can arise, talking about permitted activities in outer space. What do, like I said, those treaties kind of set forth specific ways that countries are allowed to use space, and also ways that they shouldn't really use space, like, for staging weapons or things like that. And so these legal issues can arise if a country is trying to do something that maybe other countries think it's not permitted to do. There's also, of course, liability for collisions or other harm. There is the liability convention, but it's not terribly specific. And like I said, it was kind of ratified a long time ago, and it didn't really comprehend things like mega constellations like SpaceX's Starlink, or other just massive moving parts up in space that really increase the risk of a collision. And along with that, there's the responsible management of space debris. I'm sure many of you are aware that space debris is a real problem and becoming even more so. And there's a lot of stuff up there, and there's a lot of risk of people hitting other things. And so there's a lot of questions about, are you responsible for your own debris, or who's responsible for cleaning that up, and who's responsible if there's a collision as well. Of course, there's, rules on the use of the moon and other celestial bodies, especially now as we have private companies like SpaceX trying to travel to places like Mars and talking about all these, grand visions of terraforming Mars and turning it into a human colony and things like that. That may be a ways out, but obviously there are questions of whether that's legal use or not. And if it is, whose country's rules are going to govern the use of another planet. And then, like I mentioned, you have typical issues faced by any business, in terms of, labor and laws and rules about workplace injury and things like that. And so turning now to the society, we're actually the Society for the Space Law and the Law of the Sea. We mostly deal with space law related things, but like I said, the Law of the Sea plays an integral part in the development of space law. And so we cover that as well. So the society itself is a pretty small group. There's only a handful of us, 5 or so of us on the board, and then a few hundred members. Membership is mostly limited to people at the law school, although we host events that, of course, anyone is welcome to attend. And essentially, what we do, there's sort of 2 main things that we do. We have sort of on-campus events and then the moot court competition. So on campus, we bring in, we host talks by legal experts in space law, both public and private. So we'll bring in, attorneys who are part of the new Space Force that are writing the rules and regulations for how that's going to play out. We'll also bring in, attorneys, general counsel for SpaceX, or, like Atlas Space, which is a company that operates in Michigan, that deal with space law related issues and also just international law more generally. And then we also, we host social events related to space, like visiting university observatories and things like that. And basically just try to promote the interest of space among law students, and try to provide sort of a path for people, and sort of help students to realize that there is a lot of work available in the space law field, even though, as I mentioned up top, it kind of sounds very, Star Trek-y, not real. There's a lot of interesting work going on in space law, and so we're trying to encourage students to consider a career in that. And then as well, another big part of what the society does is we attend a yearly moot court competition, which is essentially like a mock trial. And so it's a yearly competition, and it's international. There's sort of regional events in North America, Asia, Europe, Africa, South America, and then each of those kind of sends a team to the international finals. And so every year, the students argue a hypothetical international space law issue, which is usually one country versus another. And so the International Institute for Space Law, which is an organization based, I think, out of Washington, D.C., will write a problem, just sort of write a fact pattern, and then the students will have to conduct legal research on the space law related issues. And also, as I mentioned, the laws are often very broad or non-existent. And so you also have to look into principles from sea law, or just draw on other general principles of international law, national law. And then the students will prepare sort of a legal brief for both sides, and then argue before a panel of judges who are legal experts in international law and also space law. They're kind of the same people who we invite to host talks, are the same people who judge these events. You have international judges, general counsels at big private space companies, or attorneys from NASA and other organizations like that. And so, for example, this is the front page of the brief for one side from this year's competition, which was between two made-up states called Proclivia and Asteria, which sound kind of like medicines or something. And it concerned mega constellations and autonomous space operations. So just as an example, in this case, essentially, one country allowed a private company to launch a mega constellation into space, and another country was also launching, the other country was launching a satellite, and the country's single satellite collided with a satellite from the mega constellation, and it crashed back to Earth and caused a bunch of damage, as well as obviously damaging, as you know, satellites are incredibly expensive, and so these very expensive satellites were damaged. Excuse me. And so the legal questions arising were essentially, you know, who is at fault for this accident, and what exactly should their punishment be. And so we had a team of 3 first-year law students participate in the competition this year. Unfortunately, it was all remote. Usually it takes place on the campus of Georgetown University's law school in Washington, D.C., but this year it was remote. And our team, very excitingly, made it to the semifinals, where we were unfortunately knocked out. But as I mentioned, you know, this provides a very interesting insight into space law related issues, and usually the problems are way more futuristic, although the judges or the writers noted this year that obviously the issue of mega constellations is very currently relevant with things like Starlink, and you know, it's really only a matter of time before a problem like this arises, where satellites will crash into each other, and then, you know, states will have to battle it out to decide who is legally liable. And so with that, thank you. I think I've done about 15 minutes, and then I understand there's a bit of time for questions. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask, I guess, in the chat, which I will figure out how to read. And yeah, thank you very much for attending my presentation.
Thank you, Michael. That was very informative. I learned a lot. I think you did too, right?
Yes.
Yes, it was very interesting, and we love your slides.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were like thinking, we were like, oh, what, I wonder if there's an example. So I'm glad that you shared that at the end.
Mm-hmm.
Do you happen to remember which of the countries ended up being at fault?
Well, the questions are kind of posed so that it's very, very level, and so both sides are pretty much equally responsible, if you will, and it really comes down to just who can argue better. And so it was essentially one country kind of launched this mega constellation very irresponsibly, and they didn't really do a lot of background checks on the company. But the other country, you know, fired a satellite straight into the middle of it. And so it was kind of, you know, you launched an irresponsible mega constellation, but also you just fired a satellite straight into it, fully realizing that it was there and that you'd probably crash into it. So it's problems like that where there isn't really one responsible side, and you're really more judged on your ability to argue the legal issues convincingly before the judges.
Makes sense. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry that it had to be virtual this year, but I hope it was still worthwhile. And
yeah, still very worthwhile. Yeah, the team really enjoyed it, and yeah, they did a good job for it being virtual.
Yeah, congrats to them.
Yeah. We do have a question.
We have a question in the chat from Ernie. Ernie asks, what is the enforcement mechanism for space law? Suppose country X decides to ignore decisions.
Sure. So, for example, in the moot court, if I go backwards on my slides, you see this is before the International Court of Justice. So one of the premises for this case is that both countries agree that the International Court of Justice will make a decision and that will be binding on them. And, you know, you've really kind of struck on one of the central hallmarks and the central criticisms of international law, which is that if a country doesn't want to listen to a decision, even of a binding authority like the International Court of Justice, I mean, they technically don't have to, but of course, then you would run the risk of other countries not cooperating with you in other endeavors or levying sanctions against you, or not working with you. And so the enforcement mechanism is really just, you know, if you stop obeying the rules of the rulings of the International Court of Justice, then you won't really get to participate in the international field anymore. And people will just not really respect you as a country. Although obviously you can understand how a country like the United States probably doesn't care so much about that, and they're kind of happy to just do whatever they want and not be sort of bound by international law, because they're a huge country, and they don't really need to be, a sanction against the United States is not that serious compared to a sanction against a smaller country. And so, in this case, again, like I said, the countries kind of agree that the International Court of Justice will sort out their problem. In other cases, countries will enter sort of arbitration, where they both agree that they'll hire some third-party arbiters and mediators to kind of argue the decision. And it's like a court, but not with the International Court of Justice judges, but just with some arbitrators. And usually the countries will abide by that decision because they bring on their own arbiters. And so the decision is almost always pretty fair towards both sides. And again, the countries generally want to abide by these international law obligations, because if they don't, they're going to risk getting hit back with things like sanctions.
Great. Yeah, Ernie, let us know in the chat if
yeah, it's a very good question, though.
follow-up.
I mean, and you've struck on the central questions of international law, which is how do you enforce it? Because unlike national law, where we have things like police or FBI or whatever, you don't have that in the international stage. Yeah. I see, Christopher, you're raising your hand. I don't know if that was
Yes, we're
Yeah.
gonna ask you to unmute. So you should-
Yeah, so if you know about that piece of the Chinese rocket that's like planning to fall on the Earth very soon, if you were the lawyer of that Chinese space company, what would you be feeling right now? What would you be thinking right now? How can you save this company if it hits a metropolitan area?
Yeah, I mean, if I were, I'm sure as they are, if I were the attorney for the Chinese National Space Agency or whoever launched it, I don't actually know who launched it, I'd be pretty nervous. Especially if it crashes, like I mentioned, if it crashes in Australia and damages something, Australia is going to come knocking at China's door and ask, where's the money to fix our roads or buildings or whatever, or money if someone happens to unfortunately get killed or injured by it, or for example, in this case that was argued here, this moot court case, the satellite actually crashed into Antarctica, and it had a radioactive power source on board that kind of poisoned a big swath of Antarctica, and sort of left sort of radioactive fallout that messed up a bunch of scientific experiments. And so I think in that same thread, China could very well be responsible in the same way that in this case, it was argued that the country that let that satellite crash was responsible. And if it causes widespread damage, China may be asked to pay a lot of money, or they may turn around and, if it was launched by a private company, make the private company pay a lot of money.
Okay. So I have a question. So Michael, you talked a little bit about how, space law in your presentation today is a lot different than what we've been hearing all morning and what we'll probably hear most tomorrow. And not a lot of people in like the College of Engineering, at least that I've met, consider space law as like a career option, or even like know a lot about it. So do you have any recommendations for students that want to learn more about the policy side of it to influence like maybe their own decisions in the future on projects?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think especially in space law, I mean, like you can imagine in a lot of other industries, just having lawyers like myself with I have a small background in computer science, but not like a full-on engineer or like astrophysics or something like that. It makes it more difficult for me to understand how the rules should be written, because I might say that this is a great rule in theory, but obviously practically that might not work, from an engineering standpoint or something like that. And so even as someone who might be focused more on the engineering side, or any kind of STEM field related to space, there's still a lot of need for those kind of people to be helping to write these policies at government levels, or helping private companies to comply with the policies that are written. So it kind of goes on both sides of the public and private sector. in terms of where to look for those kind of career opportunities, that's a good question and something that we are constantly searching out at the society. I suppose if you're interested, I would encourage you to reach out to us. I don't know if I can like attach our like board email address, but we have, as I said, we're constantly bringing in speakers from these different companies and public sector areas that concern space law. And of course, just because you're an engineer doesn't mean you can't help with these kind of policy decisions. And I think, you're more than welcome to attend our talks if you might find that interesting. And of course, I think come fall and next winter, we're going to plan to have events in person, which I think the university is planning to operate that way. So you'll have to trek down from North Campus to the law school on Central Campus. I know it's a long way, but we would really more than welcome people to come by. And yeah, I think that's a great way to learn more about what kind of jobs are available.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people on the call will appreciate that. If you could share that information on like what's the best way to contact the society, we'd really appreciate that. You can share it in the Slack too, if that's easier.
Oh yeah, sure. I'll send it in the Slack chat after this. I'll send our board email address and also my personal email address. I'm obviously on the board, so either one will get to me. And I'm more than welcome anyone to reach out with questions, or if you have an interest in space law and want to talk more.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for your talk, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.